Hello. Oh, good morning. Good morning, everyone. We continue our journey on discernment this morning with Dr. John Lewis. And I am going to turn it over to him because I want to hear everything he has to say for every minute. Thank you for coming, and I hope you are getting as much out of this as I am because it's wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ray. Good morning. I hope you've all got the handout. I'm going to do a brief review of last week right up at the top. And then I had a comment after our class last session that I'm going to follow up with. But let's do the review from last week very quickly for anyone who might not have been here. First, we talked about how God's saving power creates new life out of death. The story of Jesus. The cross to resurrection. I mean, that's the most extraordinary death to life sequence. But that death to life sequence happens in all of our lives every day of the week. And so part of what we talked about was, what does that look like from death to life in daily life? Second, it's the Spirit of the risen Christ, says Paul, that God pours into our hearts in baptism. And so the Spirit of Christ guides us in our discernment of how to be Christ in the world. And third, Paul says that all of us who have been baptized into Christ have clothed ourselves with Christ. In a sense, we wear Christ like a garment. And I talked about how that was a metaphor from the theater about the actors who would portray a character in a drama by clothing themselves in the clothing appropriate for that character. And so by wearing Christ in our daily lives, we are portraying our interpretation of Jesus in all that we do. And that led to a conversation about how living Jesus can actually come with some risk. One of you asked a great question, well, what's the risk? And after the class, Jenny came up to me and said, well, I have, she said it nicely, I have a really more involved answer than you gave. And which is really good. That's why having discussions like this are so good, because most of you come up with a lot better things to say than I can. But I'm going to just let her say what she wanted to say about risk. How can living Jesus be a risk in the world? So Jenny, go right ahead.
Well, I don't know that I had a better answer.
Well, better.
I had one that came to me, and so what I was thinking about risk is that Jesus spoke up for vulnerable people over and over again. If you look at Matthew, the Sermon on the Mount or the Sermon on the Plain, you see that Jesus is speaking up for vulnerable people, and some people who are living out Christ choose to do that in a way that's advocating for others, caring for the sick and the homeless and all kinds of people who are in need. The hungry, absolutely. And the problem with doing that in today's age, in my opinion, is that our culture has kind of confused religion and politics. And so if you speak up about, or if you act in ways that are helping others that has become political, you run the risk of losing a lot of things, like, excuse me, like relationships with friends or with family. You run the risk of, in some cases, even physical harm. There are a lot of risks to really trying to act like Jesus did toward people who are suffering. And that was my comment.
Thank you. And that really fits right into what we're going to talk about today. It fits right in with what Garrett had to say earlier, for those of you who were here. And that is, living Jesus in a world that is self-promotive comes with risk. And we have to really be convinced that this life-giving power of God, from death to life, this life-giving power of God is real. And the more we experience that life-giving power of God, the more convinced we are, the more persuaded we are that that power is the power over death and all things evil and destructive. So we're going to focus today in our third stop on this pilgrimage back to the early church. We're going to stop in the city of Philippi in what we would call northern Greece today, where we are going to hear Paul writing to them and talking about the logic of the cross. Now, what we mean by the logic of the cross is that to have the mind of Christ means a lot of things, and Paul talks a lot about having the mind of Christ. Sometimes that comes across as being quite static. So I want you to think for a minute about what we do with our minds. We see and interpret the world around us, and we use our minds to reason how we're going to engage the world that we see. And so the logic of the cross is how Jesus in his own mind set about to live into God's will for the world, and how he engaged the vulnerable, how he engaged the outcasts, how he engaged the elites and challenged them to come to see the world through the eyes of God and God's will for the flourishing of the world. So we're going to go to Philippi, and we're going to hear one passage today, and we're going to talk about it, and then I've got questions I'm going to offer to you as we go through this, and I'm going to encourage you, as always, to please engage with one another and with me in a conversation, because that's where we learn. Before we read the passage, I want to introduce one Greek word that really matters in this passage. It's the word phroneo. And what it really meant in the Greek world of Paul and Jesus was, it was about seeing things the same way, about seeing things with a particular mindset. And ultimately, because we see the world a certain way, we reason our lives in that world a certain way. And for Paul, this word phroneo signifies a common pattern of thinking and acting that leads the community to see the world and to see life as Jesus Christ sees life, and for them to respond in Christ-like ways to that world. So, in a way, we're talking about the logic of the cross is really the way Paul does moral reasoning. Reasoning about how to engage every situation he faced in his life. And what we're being called to do is to see the world through his eyes and to engage the world in ways that he would engage the world. So let me just start. I've got the passage laid out here for you. And I'm going to make some comments as we go through. I encourage you, if you have questions, just either don't raise your hand because I won't see it. Just call out, I got a question or I got a comment, please. I'll be watching, but I'm going to encourage you to let your voice be heard. So this is Philippians chapter 2. And my wife and I, she's here by the way, Pat was finally able to make it, and she's heard a lot about you all and finally was able to be here, not serving at our own church. But in our church, which is the Episcopal Church, we're a more liturgical church. we assign readings every week. And this reading that we're about to hear, we assign this reading for every single Palm Sunday that begins Holy Week. And there's a reason why that is. But so every year on Palm Sunday, we hear this read. That's how important we think this passage is. So let's look at it. Philippians, I'm going to pick up in the middle of chapter 2, verse 2. Paul says, "Be of the same mind and of one mind." Now, in bold there, I've highlighted same mind, one mind. That's the verb phroneo in Paul's Greek letter text. So you can see that what he's really saying is reason the same way. Reason only one way. And of course, you know where this is headed. It's reason the one way as Jesus reasoned. But I'll get to that in a second. Be of the same mind. Be of one mind. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility regard others as better than yourselves. Let each of you look not to your own interests, but to the interests of others. Let the same mind, and there's that word phroneo yet again, reason the same way as was in Christ Jesus. Now let me stop right there. 3 times in one little short passage, he's used that same verb. That's a big asterisk that says, flashing light, important, important, important. Reason this one way, reason the way Jesus reasoned. Now, before we even get into Paul's interpretation of that reasoning, he's already summarized it. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility regard others as better than yourselves. I don't think probably need to go any further to say, set that over against how we see the world, even our culture operating today. That's why there's risk associated with reasoning like Jesus reasons. Do nothing from selfish ambition. Well, you know, that is about as counter to the world's ways as one can get. And it's about as counter to a lot of the messages that we get every day from so many sources. Let each of you look not to your own interest, but to the interests of others. Now, does that sound like a way to get ahead in the world? Depends on who you ask. I've been here 3 Sundays now. I already know you all know how to answer that question. Of course, it's the way we are. We put the interests of other people ahead of our own. That's how the world flourishes. Not taking advantage of people for our own benefit, but putting their needs ahead of our own. Garrett talked about several ways you all embody that in your ministries to the world. And it's really clear that message has sunk in deeply with you. So as I've done the last week and now this week, it's sort of like I'm preaching to the choir. You guys already know how to sing this tune, and basically about all I can do is look at biblical passages and really put little check marks by what you already know. That's what I feel like I'm doing, and it's such a pleasure to be here to be able to do that. So let me pause there for a minute before we get into what this reasoning looks like. Questions or comments? Yes.
I love your statement to start out with, that the logic of the cross is so important. You have to believe fully in, as Jesus did. He knew all of his, I gather, he knew all of his life, the way he would end. Therefore, he didn't feel risk for?
Yes, it shifted the risk because he trusted
Yeah.
that God was calling him to be this way.
That's a flip-flop in my head.
It's a flip-flop in all of our heads. You want to say, why does it feel like a flip-flop? I mean,
I never got that. It's like what you got the lottery at the end, so I don't have to worry about giving away my money.
the winning ticket, I've got the winning ticket, so I don't have to worry about.
And we all spend more time worrying about something.
That's right. So, last week we talked about really trusting in the power of God. And Paul says in 1 Corinthians 2, I came among you as Christ crucified because I want you to put your faith and trust and confidence in the power of God that's so strong and so amazing that God can bring life out of death. Nobody on the earth, the emperor included, can make that happen. That's where we want to put our trust. And so once we know that, once we're convinced of that, we can live this way. And that's really what Paul's about to spell out for us. So thank you for that. Yes, please.
So in verse 4 on look not to your own interest in the interest of others, speaking of church to community, before the pandemic, our church did a book study during Sunday school hour on When Helping Hurts. One of the concepts that the authors pointed out was that the church needs, speaking of risk, needs to look at community not as we perceive the need that you have. They can look and say, oh, we see they need food, or they look at cars broken down, or whatever. We perceive a need. However, we don't ever ask the community. So it may be a perceived need. However, we never listen because we didn't ask.
Great comment. Pat's going to be embarrassed by this, but I learned something in marriage about 35 years ago. I did something, and she said, why in the world did you do that? And she said, I said, I thought you needed it. And she said, well, next time, ask me. That was the last time I anticipated something without asking. But we do that all the time. We think we know better than someone else about what they need. So if I could just digress for a minute, in the story of Bartimaeus, blind Bartimaeus in the Gospel of Mark in chapter 10, Jesus has Bartimaeus come to him. He's a blind beggar. Jesus, all you got to do is look at him. He's a blind beggar. Jesus could presume to know what he wants. He keeps saying, have mercy on me. But the first thing Jesus does, he says, what do you want me to do for you? So Jesus asks, what do you think you need? Let me respond. As opposed to Jesus deciding what Bartimaeus needed. So thank you for that. It's always important to hear the voices of the people we want to serve and to process how we can best serve them. But let's move to verse 6. So let the same mind or the same reasoning be in you that was in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited. Now, the world is filled with people who have power and authority, who exploit that power and authority for their own well-being. The way of Jesus is the reverse of that. He did not exploit his own status and power for his own good. Now, once again, is there risk in that? You bet. Because, number one, that's not how the world expects me to act. If I have power and authority, The world is expecting me to exercise that. Now, what we might say is, as followers of Jesus, well, you have power and authority, but we expect you to act in a way for the common good. But that's another class session. Second, verse 7, Christ emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, being born in human likeness, being found in human form. So he emptied himself of his status and power, his equality with God, to serve other people. So, can anybody tell a story about something that happened this week where you saw someone empty themselves of power and status to serve someone else? I know it's a challenge to get these questions. You haven't been thinking about what happened last week, but I'm going to give you a minute. Anybody see that happen? We know it happened. Question is, can we see it? Yes, please.
So you're asking about emptying yourself to. There's a funny illustration going on right behind us. They're literally going all around the courtyard, emptying a cup and emptying water into each other's cup and passing it on. And that's the way they make it all the way around the circle. So it's kind of like a parable playing out before us.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Garrett. Yeah. I saw people out there, but it was clear they were doing
I
something.
wasn't sure what they were doing until I made
To-
it over here.
So, I invite you in the coming week, watch for someone who you know as a person of power and authority. Watch for some moment when that person really sets that aside and instead of lording over someone, actually puts themselves in the service of someone. Watch for that. I'm going to give her a moment to just...
Oh, and there's a good story. Amy Crouch, who's a kind of former writer and I think the former editor of Christianity Today. He tells a story. He wrote a book on power a few years ago, and one of the stories he tells is before he goes, because he does a lot of traveling, so he goes around speaking everywhere. And before he goes, he always tries to make sure that he does the dishes. Because he knows when he's gone, his like chore around the house is always doing the dishes. And when he's traveling, he can't obviously do that chore. And he realizes the sacrifice the rest of his family has to make so that he can go out and do his thing. And so rather than thinking that it's getting too big for his britches, you might say, when he's out being courted at all these speaking engagements, he takes that time while he's doing the dishes before he leaves to kind of empty himself of that ego and kind of recognize the importance of not, putting himself out there like that.
Got a great story. Thank you. Yes. Yes, please.
As a good old Southerner from Arkansas, looking at this, as I've looked at it through seminary and preacher, how this was assimilated and interpreted by the South, the Bible Belt, during all those years of enslavement, Jim Crow, segregation, and of course, to me, being from Arkansas, having that sort of legacy on my head, when I see that word and how we interpret that concept historically, it's almost like it's a dangerous word because blacks have done that historically. They've been enslaved, and so it's like, do I want to really replicate that? And I know there's nuances here that need to be deciphered.
Do I really want to put myself in the service of others.
Well, yeah, how does that work itself out
Yeah.
socially, politically?
Socially and politically, how does it work itself out? So I probably don't have a good answer, but here's one response to that. I know in every situation that I walk into, I'm trying to be conscious that as an older, white, educated male, I'm probably one of the more, and some would say, the most dominant person in the room. And what I've learned from that is when I go into that room, my first step is keep your mouth shut. Because soon as I open it up, some people are going to give me more authority than I'm wanting to take. And so emptying oneself of that is about allowing all the other voices to be heard. And I think I'm a native Texan, so I'm a Southerner too. And I grew up in a city in Southeast Texas that was probably one of the most racially biased cities in the South. And I saw many people of color who put themselves in the service of others sort of higher up the hierarchy. And I thought, and I heard people talk about, well, that's what Jesus did. And so it's okay to do that. Well, it's not okay to do that in that setting because that's an inversion. It's a perversion of this passage. This passage is about people in elevated positions coming underneath to serve as the foundation of others. And that's just a response. It doesn't answer your question, but this passage has been put to some really oppressive uses. I mean, I can even tell you a group, unnamed group years ago, the people in power heard squawking from the people in the margins of this group. And the word to them was, keep those voices down for the good of the whole. Now that's a use of this passage that perverts it, where the people in power say to the people on the margins, keep your voice down. You might cause a little trouble. Well, Jesus, I think, would say that's good trouble. And Paul would say that's good trouble. But boy, is that hard. That's hard for people in the center. People in the positions of authority. It's hard to hear. But that's back to the risk. Back to the risk. I mean, there is risk to actually proclaim the good news. The good news is turning the world upside down and serving the people in need. Great questions. Yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to offer an example of what you asked for.
Great. I'm going to give you the microphone because you have a softer voice than I do.
I wanted to give an example of.
Closer to you.
I wanted to give an example of what you asked for about people emptying themselves. And this is in a community base, a community doing that. Because in Comal County has just built a big new shelter for domestic violence and sexual assault. And they asked the community to help them furnish the rooms. And every single room was furnished, and it was individuals and friends who had the opportunity to do that, as well as organizations that came together to do that. And it was a beautiful example of people who had more giving to others.
Thank you. All right, let's move to verse 8. So, this is probably an early church hymn, which is why it's in the form that you see here. Paul's reminding them of an early church hymn about Jesus and his self-emptying in the service of others. So he goes on to say in verse 8, Christ humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. So what he's saying is that humility is committing oneself to be obedient to God no matter the cost, no matter the risk. And of course, much church tradition says, well, Jesus is aware of that risk from the beginning. He's clearly aware that he is trying to turn the world upside down. Paul's aware of being a follower trying to turn the world upside down. And the powers that be in the world don't like that. And so Christ was obedient to God, even to the point of death on a cross. But then we see a big turn here in verse 9. Therefore, now, we've just heard what Christ did. God saw what Christ did, how Christ lived his life, and God is about to honor that faithfulness. Therefore, God also highly exalted him and gave him the name that is above every name. So God has raised Jesus from the dead. And when he says he's given Christ the name that is above every name, in that ancient world, a person's name often communicated something about the person's character and nature. And so when Paul is saying here, or the early church is saying, that God gave Jesus the name that's above every name, he's saying this is the human character that I affirm, and my evidence is I'm raising this person from the dead. I'm bringing death to new life, and I'm saying to the rest of us, to the rest of you, this is the perfect embodiment of the image and likeness of God in which I created everyone. I'm giving Jesus the name that's above every name. You are to set your sights on him and him alone for how to live, which is why every week I love these images that are on the service sheet. The cross of Christ, I'm going to say Jesus is at the center, and all these stars, we're about to see Paul actually refers to the Philippians as stars shining in the world. They are all focused on this one person for how to discern how to live faithfully in the world. It's a perfect image for what we're talking about here. Therefore, God highly exalted him and gave him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee should bend in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. By raising Jesus from death to life, God put God's stamp of approval, we might say, on the way Jesus lived his human life. And Paul is saying to the Philippians, here is your model. Here is your model for how to live and how to reason your way in daily life. Reason as Christ reasoned. Give up power and authority to serve others. Be humble, put the interests of others ahead of yourself, and always be obedient to God no matter the cost. All right, I'm going to pause right there for a minute because the next verse turns us in the direction of discernment. So I'm going to pause and say, any further questions or comments about this entire pattern of reasoning that Paul's laid out for the Philippians? Easy? No. Life-giving? Yes. And that's ultimately why we want to live by this reasoning, because we know God works through this way of life to bring life to the world. Now, here's a question. Has Paul told the Philippians anything about how they are to act concretely in whatever's going on in their community? Maybe I should put it this way. If this letter arrived from Paul to Woodland, does it tell you any particular thing you need to do? Does it say anything about taking mattresses to people that need beds, or the ways that you serve in the community? Anything concrete here? No. So look at the next verse. Verse 12. Therefore, my beloved, just as y'all have always obeyed God, not only in my presence, but much more now in my absence, y'all work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For God is at work among you, enabling you both to will and to work for God's good pleasure. Do you see what Paul's done? He said, here's how I want you to reason. Now I'm putting it back to you. He's putting it back to Woodland Church. Y'all, and I'm a good Southerner. I use y'all all the time. This really captures the plural you in this passage. If you read it in the New Revised Standard Version, it'll just say, work out your own salvation. And most people will read that individually. What he's saying, though, he's saying to this group right here, y'all have to work out your salvation together. Now, what does he mean by salvation? He means work out the life that God desires for you today and do it together. And you do it together by using this reasoning, this Christ-like reasoning that Paul's laid out here in the passage. And it's a deliberative conversation. You deliberate on what that looks like in each of your individual lives. You're not trying, I don't know how many people are here, but let's just say it's 40 or 50. You're not trying to all agree on one thing to do. What you're trying to do is help each one of you live into this pattern, this way of life in your own context. Which means you have to know something about one another's lives. You have to know something about Jesus for sure. And you have to know a lot about where the power of God is working in your lives. That's why Paul, in verse 13, he says, God's already at work among you. What he's saying to us is, look at where God is at work. And reason backwards from that. What are you all doing that is leading to these experiences of new life in the community? Because that's what Paul's really saying is when you live Jesus, God's power shows up and your community is enriched in the way that you give yourselves to one another. So let's just take a minute. I got a couple of questions here. Where is God already at work right here, bringing moments of new life to this community, to this Woodland community? Yes?
One of the things that I have noticed in reflecting on what we do.
That's okay. I want everybody to hear.
One of the things that I've noticed on reflecting of what we do corporately is that a lot of our ministries are sort of organic. Somebody recognized a need, became aware of a need in the community, like the bed ministry, and brought it to the group and the group decided to affirm it and involve themselves in it. When we started the CAM lunch bagging ministry, it was because COVID had closed a shelter that we were volunteering at. So we were worried about those people that were no longer going to be receiving a meal. And that's when we found a way to serve through CAM. So I just think those things are the most satisfying because, again, they grow up organically.
So if I can just build on that, you've just described two thriving ministries. And I would say that's two different ways that your community has worked out its own salvation together. Because you're experiencing God's life-giving power, not only enriching others, but experiencing that life together in the way that you've come to those kinds of decisions. That's exactly what he's talking about. It's also why I started this morning and said, I feel like I'm preaching to the choir. I'm not sure y'all even need to hear any of this because you already know it at some really deep level. Anybody else? Anything else? Where God is already at work, right now, right here. Yes? Oh, sorry. Okay.
It's okay. I was just thinking, thank you. I was just thinking that, you know, I spent my entire life being a teacher, a high school teacher, which could get me committed, but I can remember thinking I wasn't doing enough, that I tried to rescue people. And I had a very wise high school principal tell me one time, that's not your job. That your job is not to save people. Somebody's already done that. Your job is to teach them and help them when they come in your purview, and listen, pay attention, do everything you can, and then hand them off to other people who are going to help them. And it's like my sister and I went to the Vatican, and they told us that all the paintings there are mosaics, that they're put together with tiny little tiles. And my sister said, it's just hard to believe. I need to look that closely because I think that's painted. And she said, it's like life. You know, we each have our own little tile to put in, but we need to pay attention when our time comes or there's going to be a gap.
That's lovely. Thank you. I see my time is up, but I want to just encourage you to look at some of these other questions. Where is God's power at work here, and whose actions, whose Christ-like actions are contributing to that? The more we can pay attention to these kinds of mosaic tiles, small as they might be, the more persuaded we are that the big picture of God's power is real. And that's really the point here. So next week is my last week. I am going to sum up what we've been doing, and I'm going to show you from Paul's letter to the first letter to the Corinthians how that practice worked in the early church. And you're probably going to see you're already doing it. So I realize, again, I'm going to be preaching to the choir, but I'm still going to preach. So I'll see you next week. Thank you.